Here's a number that should tell you something. The global peptide supplement market is worth over $4 billion. It's projected to hit $11 billion by 2035. And that's not pharmaceutical peptides. That's wellness peptides. BPC-157, TB-500, GHK-Cu, CJC-1295, ipamorelin, sermorelin. The stuff people are injecting into themselves in their bathrooms based on Reddit threads and Instagram influencer protocols. At the same time, in April of this year, RFK Jr. announced that 12 peptides, including BPC, TB-500, and GHK-Cu, were being removed from the FDA's restricted list. And the FDA has convened an advisory panel for July of 2026, specifically to consider adding several of them back to the legal compounding list. We're in the middle of the most significant regulatory shift in peptide history right now, this week. So the question I want to answer today is the one I get asked constantly. Are these things real? Are they safe? Are they legal? And honestly, should I be on them? I'm going to give you the clinical answer, the honest answer, and my own personal answer. So let's go. Welcome to Honestly. I'm Chris Lee, MD, plastic surgeon and aesthetic medicine physician in Chestnut Hill, right outside Boston, Massachusetts. And today, I want to talk to you about something I find genuinely fascinating and also genuinely complicated: peptides. Let me start with the basics. A peptide is simply a short chain of amino acids, the building blocks of life and proteins. Your body makes thousands of these naturally. They act as signaling molecules or chemical messengers that tell cells and tissues to do specific things: grow, repair, produce hormones, reduce inflammation, heal. The concept isn't exotic. Insulin is a peptide. Glucagon is a peptide. The GLP-1 drugs that are reshaping the weight loss landscape, those are peptides. These molecules are fundamental to how your biology works. Now, what's changed in the last decade is that researchers and clinicians, then influencers, and then biohackers, and then finally your neighbor's gym trainer started looking at these specific peptides and asking, what if we could use these as targeted therapeutic tools? What if we could give someone BPC-157, a peptide naturally found in gastric juice, and accelerate their tissue healing? What if sermorelin could stimulate the pituitary to release more growth hormone without the risks of synthetic HGH? What if GHK-Cu could signal skin cells to produce more collagen? The honest answer is some of these ideas have real compelling scientific support. Some are mostly hope and marketing, and some sit in a genuinely interesting gray zone where the anecdotal signal is strong, the mechanism is plausible, but the human clinical trials just don't exist yet. Today, I'm going to tell you which is which, as clearly as I possibly can. Now, to understand where we are, you need to understand what happened in 2023. The FDA assigned 19 peptides to what they call Category 2 of the bulk substances list. Substances that they determined had significant safety concerns that prevented compounding pharmacies from legally making them for human use. The list included BPC-157, TB-500, CJC-1295, ipamorelin, GHK-Cu, injectable, and others. The FDA's stated concerns were immunogenicity risks, meaning the potential for immune reactions, peptide-related impurities from compounding, and insufficient safety data in humans. The FDA essentially said, we don't have enough information to confirm these are safe, and the theoretical risks are concerning enough that we're restricting access until we do. Makes sense. The practical effect was significant. Compounding pharmacies, which had been the primary legitimate source of these peptides for patients, could no longer legally produce them. The DOJ prosecuted at least one major compounding pharmacy, Tailor-Made Compounding, for distributing unapproved peptides and forced a $1.79 million forfeiture. The legal supply largely collapsed, so what filled the vacuum was the gray market. Overseas suppliers, research chemical vendors, selling products labeled not for human use, and an online marketplace with essentially no quality control. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting and timely. In April of 2026, HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. announced the removal of 12 peptides from Category 2, including BPC-157, TB-500, GHK-Cu injectable, and several others. He made the announcement on Joe Rogan, so take what you will from that. And it definitely serves as its own commentary on the current moment in American health policy. But the regulatory significance is real, regardless of how it happened. Removal from category 2 does not automatically make these peptides legal to compound. It means they are no longer explicitly prohibited. They're now in kind of a regulatory limbo where the FDA needs to affirmatively place them on approved compounding lists to make them fully accessible. That decision is now before the FDA advisory panel, scheduled for July 23rd and 24th of 2026. The panel will specifically consider BPC-157, TB-500, and a handful of others for inclusion on these 503A bulk lists, which is the list of substances compounding pharmacies are permitted to work with. I want to be honest about what this means practically for patients right now. The regulatory picture is actively shifting. As of this recording, these compounds are in a transitional state. No longer explicitly restricted, but not yet explicitly approved for compounding. A responsible physician can begin having different conversations with patients about these compounds, but the infrastructure for legitimate, quality-controlled access isn't fully rebuilt yet. The gray market still exists. Quality varies wildly, and the safety concerns that drove the original crackdown, particularly around impurities and immunogenicity, haven't been fully resolved by the regulatory shift. The policy changed. The science didn't change overnight. I want to address this honestly because I have mixed feelings about this. The FDA's safety concerns were not fabricated. It's completely legitimate that they don't have all the evidence that they need to make a full assessment of these. The evidence base for most of these peptides is genuinely thin, by at least the standards of pharmaceutical approval. Most of the compelling data comes from animal studies, not controlled human trials. The FDA isn't wrong that we have limited safety data on long-term human use. At the same time, there's a real and reasonable argument that the risk calculus was applied unevenly. These are compounds with plausible mechanisms, generally favorable short-term profiles in the populations using them, and no documented pattern of serious harm at clinical doses under medical supervision. Banning them from compounding while simultaneously allowing far more dangerous compounds to circulate freely, and while the gray market immediately filled the void with far less regulated product, is not obviously a patient safety win. I think that tension is worth acknowledging honestly, rather than pretending it doesn't exist. So let's get into the basics of some of these. Let's talk about BPC-157. BPC-157 stands for Body Protection Compound 157. It's a synthetic pentadecapeptide, 15 amino acids, derived from a protein naturally found in gastric juice. That origin matters. It's a compound your body already produces, and the existing literature suggests it has a favorable safety profile at therapeutic doses. The mechanism of action is interesting. BPC-157 appears to promote angiogenesis, meaning the growth of new blood cells. It activates growth hormone receptor signaling, and it modulates nitric oxide synthesis. All of these pathways are relevant to tissue repair and healing. The evidence, or the animal data, is compelling. Studies in rats and mice show accelerated healing of tendons, muscles, ligaments, bones, and gut tissue. Anti-inflammatory effects, neuroprotective properties. These are real studies in peer-reviewed journal. The problem, and this is the honest problem, is that virtually all of this is animal data. The human clinical trial base is essentially non-existent. We don't have controlled randomized trials in humans showing that BPC-157 does what the animal studies suggest. Does that mean it doesn't work? Well, not necessarily. The mechanism is plausible. The anecdotal reports from patients using it under medical supervision are frequently positive. Athletes using it for injury recovery, post-surgical patients using it for healing, many of them report meaningful benefit. The challenge is that anecdote and plausible mechanism are not the same as clinical proof. I hold both of those things in my head simultaneously. I find this compound genuinely interesting, and I can't tell you with scientific certainty that it works the way its proponents claim. Anytime you're talking about BPC-157, we also need to talk about TB-500. TB-500 is a synthetic version of thymosin beta-4, a protein found naturally throughout the body that plays a role in cell migration, angiogenesis again, and inflammation regulation. It's often described as BPC-157's companion compound and frequently used alongside it as a stack. The thinking being that BPC-157 primarily drives the healing through growth factor pathways, while TB-500 provides a broader anti-inflammatory and tissue repair framework. The evidence base has the same structure as BPC-157, strong animal literature, limited human data, plausible mechanism, and a community of clinicians and patients who report positive experiences that are difficult to validate scientifically. Thymosin beta-4 itself, the natural protein, has been studied in human wound healing trials and shown some benefit. TB-500 as a specific synthetic compound has less human data. These are compounds with an interesting scientific foundation that the clinical trial infrastructure hasn't caught up to yet. The FDA advisory panel reviewing them in July 2026 is going to face the same challenge I'm describing. How do you evaluate something with compelling animal evidence, no significant human harm signals, but also no controlled human efficacy data? That is a hard regulatory question with no clean answer. I want to talk about this next class of compounds from a more personal place because I've just started a growth hormone secretog stack myself. And the stack I chose and why I chose it is worth explaining. Most of the conversation about GH peptide stacks online centers on CJC-1295 and ipamorelin. And CJC-1295 is an effective GHRH analog, that's growth hormone releasing hormone analog. It works. There are human studies showing meaningful GH elevation, but the FDA flagged adverse findings in non-clinical studies on CJC, including DNA damage in pituitary cells. The signal is not confirmed in humans at clinical doses, but it's real enough that I'd rather not make it my first choice when a better studied option is available. Tesamorelin is that option. Tesamorelin is a synthetic version of all 44 amino acids of human GHRH with a modification for stability. It was FDA approved in 2010 under the brand name Agrifta for HIV-associated lipodystrophy, visceral fat accumulation, and a newer formulation was approved in March of 2025. The FDA approval history matters to me as a physician. It means tesamorelin went through phase 3 clinical trials in humans, has a safety and efficacy database that most peptides in the conversation can only dream of, and is currently prescribable and compoundable by licensed pharmacies. That's a meaningfully different starting point than most of the compounds we're discussing today. So let's talk about how it works. The mechanism of tesamorelin-ipamorelin combination is elegant and worth understanding. Tesamorelin is a GHRH analog. It binds to GHRH receptors on the pituitary and signals to produce and release growth hormone. Ipamorelin is a growth hormone secretog that works through a completely different receptor, the ghrelin receptor, and does something specific. It suppresses somatostatin, which is the hormone that normally puts the brakes on GH release. So tesamorelin pushes the gas, ipamorelin releases the brake. Together, they produce a synergistic growth hormone pulse that's significantly greater than either compound alone. And critically, they do it in a pulsatile physiological pattern that mimics what your own body does naturally, rather than flooding the system with synthetic HGH. The result is a more controlled, more natural growth hormone environment. And importantly, because ipamorelin is selective for GH release, it doesn't significantly elevate cortisol or prolactin the way other GHRPs do. That selectivity matters for side effect profile. Now, I just started this stack. I want to be honest about the timeline. This is early, but I have noticed some significant changes. The first, or the most significant, would be my sleep changes are real, and they showed up faster than I expected. Within the first week, I noticed I was getting into deep sleep more consistently and sleeping through the night without middle of the night wakefulness I'd grown accustomed to over the past couple of years. I'd mostly just associated this with growing older. I don't know, a small bladder, who knows? But I have seen this actually happen in real time. And I know it's happening because my 8 sleep and my watch tell me that I'm getting better sleep and more deep sleep than I was ever before. I also noticed that recovery from workouts feels noticeably better. Those were the things that I was expecting based on the literature. What I wasn't expecting was that my HRV was going up. HRV stands for heart rate variability. And I want to explain why that's actually the most interesting signal of the 3, because most people tracking HRV on an Oura Ring or a Whoop have no idea what they're actually measuring. HRV is a measure of a variation in time between your heartbeats. Higher variability, somewhat counterintuitively, means your autonomic nervous system is more adaptable and better recovered. It reflects the balance between your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight, and your parasympathetic nervous system, which governs the rest and recovery. When your parasympathetic system is dominant during sleep, HRV goes up. When you're stressed, overtrained, sleep deprived, or inflamed, your sympathetic system is overreactive and your HRV goes down. Now, deep sleep is when your parasympathetic nervous system does most of its recovery work. It's the physiological environment where autonomic balance is restored. So if tesamorelin and ipamorelin are improving my sleep architecture, specifically increasing my slow wave deep sleep, then the downstream effect is better parasympathetic activity during sleep. And that shows up as an elevated HRV. The connection is real. The HRV improvement is almost certainly a direct downstream consequence of sleep architecture improvement, not a separate effect. I want to be clear that this is an N of 1 data, my experience early. I can't tell you what's going to happen with me at 3 months, but what I can tell you is that the mechanism predicts exactly what I'm seeing, and what I'm seeing matches what the literature describes for the class of compound. That's encouraging. But I'm going to keep measuring and keep honest about what changes. Let's briefly discuss sermorelin because it remains the most accessible and most clinically well understood option of this class for patients who are just starting the conversation. Sermorelin was previously FDA approved for childhood GH deficiency. It was withdrawn for commercial rather than safety reasons and remains fully prescribable and compoundable today. It's the entry point I recommend for a lot of patients, particularly those who want to explore GH optimization without immediately going to the more aggressive stack. The sleep quality improvement on sermorelin alone is real. If tesamorelin and ipamorelin is unavailable or cost prohibitive, sermorelin plus ipamorelin is a very reasonable alternative with a strong safety profile and the added benefit of being prescribable, which means a lot to some patients. Now, as a plastic surgeon, I need to talk about GHK-Cu. It's a copper peptide, glycyl L-histidyl L-lysine, bound to a copper ion. It's naturally found in human blood plasma, and its concentration declines significantly with age, which is interesting on its own. Dr. Lauren Pickert first isolated this in 1973 and noticed something remarkable. When older liver cells were exposed to young blood, they began to function more like younger cells. And GHK appeared to be a key mediating factor. That observation launched decades of research that has produced something unusual in this space: actual human clinical data. GHK-Cu appears to work differently from other peptides we've discussed. It's not primarily a secretog or a healing accelerator through growth factor pathways. It's a gene modulating agent. It appears to directly influence the expression of genes involved in tissue repair, collagen synthesis, inflammation regulation, and antioxidant defense. Studies suggest that it modulates over 4,000 human genes. That's a different mechanism and a more fundamental intervention than most of what we're talking about today. Here's what makes GHK-Cu genuinely interesting compared to most of the peptides in the conversation. There's actual human clinical evidence for topical application. Multiple dermatology trials show real outcomes: wound healing acceleration, collagen and elastin stimulation, improvement in skin laxity and texture, reduction in fine lines. In 2024, a multi-center study of GHK-Cu gel after fractional laser resurfacing showed 25% faster epithelial recovery, so skin recovery, and a 30% reduction in inflammatory markers compared to the standard care. Those are not trivial numbers in a controlled trial. For injectable GHK-Cu, the evidence base is thinner, more aligned with BPC-157 in terms of animal data being stronger than human clinical data. The FDA included injectable GHK-Cu in its Category 2 restriction for the same impurity and immunogenicity concerns. The recent removal from Category 2 means injectable GHK-Cu is now in the same transitional regulatory zone as BPC-157 and TB-500. So my honest take on GHK-Cu, the topical evidence is real and I use it clinically. I incorporate topical GHK-Cu serums into post-procedure protocols after resurfacing, after microneedling, because the wound healing and collagen stimulation data supports it, and the safety profile of topical application is extremely favorable. The injectable question is more complicated, and I navigate it case by case, depending on the patient, the indication, and what the current regulatory access looks like. So now that we've talked about some of these, I want to spend a few moments on something that often gets missed in the peptide conversation, and it matters for how we think about all of this. The most successful peptide therapeutics in history aren't BPC-157 or CJC-1295. They're semaglutide and tirzepatide. Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro, Zepbound. We talked about them in depth in episode 3, but I want to bring them back here in this context. These are peptide drugs. Semaglutide is a GLP-1 peptide, a synthetic, modified version of a naturally occurring signaling molecule in the gut. It works because it mimics a peptide your body already produces. The mechanism is elegant, the evidence is overwhelming, and the results at a population level are genuinely historic. We have never had a pharmacological weight loss intervention that works this well, this consistently, in this many people. Why does it matter for the broader peptide conversation? Because it is proof of principle. Peptide therapeutics work. The concept of using synthetic signaling molecules to achieve meaningful biological outcomes is not fringe science. It is the most validated idea in contemporary pharmacology. When people ask me if I believe in peptides, I point to semaglutide. That's what peptide medicine looks like when it goes through proper clinical development. The question for everything else we've discussed today is not, can peptides work? The answer to that is clearly yes. The question is, do these specific compounds at these specific doses in these specific indications produce the outcome being claimed? And for some of them, we still don't know. I want to spend a few minutes on something that doesn't get talked about enough. Most of the content out there about which peptides to take, what dose, what stack, almost none of it talks seriously about where the compound actually comes from. And the gap is a patient safety issue. Here's the reality of the current market. There are 3 main ways people are accessing peptides right now. The first is a licensed compounding pharmacy with a valid physician prescription, the legitimate quality controlled route. The second is an overseas supplier or domestic research chemical vendor selling products labeled not for human use, the gray market. And the third is someone's gym hookup or an online marketplace that doesn't ask questions. The outcomes for patients across these categories are not the same. The FDA has documented heavy metal contamination in gray market peptide products. Mislabeling, where the product contains something other than what the label says, or at a different concentration, is a known documented problem. Immunogenicity from peptide-related impurities, which was part of the FDA's original case for Category 2 restrictions, is a real risk with substandard manufacturing. When you buy a peptide from an overseas research chemical supplier, you genuinely do not know what it is. You genuinely do not know what is in that vial. That's not a theoretical concern. It's a documented problem. The peptides I use and prescribe come from a licensed U.S. compounding pharmacy. All of them. And that's not a preference, that's a standard. A legitimate FDA compounding pharmacy in the United States is subject to state pharmacy board oversight, must compound under a USP sterility standard, and should be able to provide a certificate of analysis, a COA, showing third-party testing results for the specific batch you're receiving. That document tells you the compound is what it says it is, at the concentration it says it is, free of all contaminants that matter. When I'm evaluating a compounding pharmacy, I look for a few things: state pharmacy license and PCCA or APC membership. Those indicate engagement with professional standards, certificate of analysis with HPLC testing for each batch, a requirement for a valid physician prescription. A legitimate pharmacy doesn't fill peptide orders without one. And they don't put dosing protocols on their website or make health claims in their marketing. Those are signs of a compliant, serious operation. Made in the USA from a licensed compounding pharmacy, that's the standard I hold myself to. And it's a standard I'd encourage anyone considering these compounds to hold as well. The regulatory landscape is shifting in a favorable direction right now, access is improving, there's never been a better time to wait for the legitimate route rather than going gray market. And for the compounds still in regulatory transition like BPC-157, the legitimate route may be weeks or months away rather than years. It might be worth the wait for some. All right, so let's get to some questions. I've been injecting BPC-157. I bought online for 2 months for a chronic shoulder injury. My shoulder feels better, but now I'm worried about whether what I bought is actually BPC-157 and whether it's safe. What should I do? I want to answer this without judgment because I understand exactly why you did what you did. You had a chronic injury, legitimate therapeutic options felt limited or inaccessible, and you found something online that people were saying helped. That's a completely understandable path. And here's my honest response. The fact that your shoulder feels better is encouraging. Either the compound is doing what proponents claim, or you're experiencing meaningful placebo effect, or your shoulder was going to improve on its own over time. Without a controlled comparison, you can't know for sure which. What concerns me more is the source. Products sold online as research chemicals or not for human use are not manufactured under pharmaceutical standards. Contamination, mislabeling, incorrect concentrations, these are real documented problems in a gray market. The FDA has flagged heavy metal contamination in some of these products. My practical advice is be careful with the gray market product. With the regulatory landscape shifting right now, legitimate compounding access to BPC-157 is likely to improve significantly over the next 6 to 12 months. If your shoulder injury warrants this kind of intervention, you can find a physician who understands peptide medicine and can work with a licensed 503A compounding pharmacy to get you a product with a certificate of analysis and pharmaceutical quality standards. It's the same compound with meaningfully safer sourcing. This is what we do here in my practice, and this is what I hold my standard to. And even in that situation, like before, because we don't have that large-scale clinical data, we don't know for sure what the long-term use may lead to or if these things actually work. But if it's helping and you feel like it's helping, then that's not for nothing. All right, let's do another question. All right, here we go. My trainer swears by CJC-1295 ipamorelin stack and wants me to try it. I'm 38. I train regularly. I sleep okay, but not great. And I'd like better recovery. Is this appropriate for me? Well, you sound exactly like me. So let's get into it. This is a conversation worth having with a physician. And the right starting point is baseline labs. IGF-1, testosterone, thyroid, basic metabolic panel. If your IGF-1 is in the lower range of normal for your age and your symptoms are real, a GH-Secretog stack is a more defensible and targeted intervention than a general wellness approach. On the specific stack your trainer recommended, I'd actually steer you toward tesamorelin and ipamorelin rather than CJC-1295 as a first choice. While CJC-1295 has been shown to maybe increase muscle mass a little bit more than tesamorelin, and tesamorelin has more effects on visceral fat. The issue here is more about FDA approval. Tesamorelin has FDA approval history and a cleaner safety record than CJC-1295, which had some concerning pituitary findings in preclinical studies. The mechanism tesamorelin, ipamorelin is well understood. Tesamorelin pushes the gas on GH release, and ipamorelin releases the brake by suppressing somatostatin. And together, they produce a synergistic pulsatile growth hormone pulse that's physiological rather than pharmacological. What you can realistically expect: sleep quality changes within 1 or 2 weeks, specifically more deep sleep, and better overnight continuity. Workout recovery improving within 2 to 4 weeks. Body composition changes over 3 to 6 months. I'm personally on the stack right now, and sleep changes hit faster than I expected. The recovery improvement followed closely. So make sure your pharmacy is a licensed US 503A compounding pharmacy with a certificate of analysis on their product. That part matters as much as which compound you choose. That being said, the theoretical benefit of CJC-1295 over tesamorelin is that CJC-1295 will stimulate body composition results, such as increased muscle mass as well as fat loss, more so than tesamorelin, as tesamorelin mostly is approved for visceral fat loss. All right. Another question. Is there a peptide you'd actually recommend to someone who just wants better skin? I use a bunch of skincare products, but I'm curious if there's something more targeted that I'm missing. Yes, it's GHK-Cu topically. Of everything we talked about today, the topical evidence for GHK-Cu in skin health is most clinically solid. It's not exotic. You can find pharmaceutical grade GHK-Cu serums from reputable skincare brands without a prescription. Look for concentrations around 0.05 to 0.1% in a stable formulation and use it consistently. Results build over 4 to 8 weeks of daily use. What it does that your typical retinol or vitamin C serum doesn't is it works upstream of collagen synthesis through a gene modulating mechanism rather than just stimulating surface level production. It has documented anti-inflammatory properties and wound healing acceleration, which is why I use it post-procedure clinically. For ongoing skin maintenance, it pairs well with your existing routine rather than replacing anything. If you're interested in something more intensive, injectable GHK-Cu in a peptide protocol supervised by a physician, that conversation is becoming more accessible as the regulatory landscape shifts. But for someone asking about the targeted skin upgrade, I think topical is a great place to start. The evidence supports it, the access is easy, and the safety profile is excellent. So I promised at the top of this episode that I'd tell you what I personally use and prescribe. So here's the honest version. I use GHK-Cu. It's part of my routine, and I use it clinically post-procedure. The human evidence supports it. I've seen it work. The safety profile is excellent. That one is easy. I'm currently on tesamorelin and ipamorelin, just started, and what I'm noticing is real. Better deep sleep, sleeping through the night, notice a better workout recovery, and my HRV has gone up. I explained earlier why the HRV improvement is almost certainly downstream signal of better sleep architecture rather than a separate effect. It's early, and it's an N of 1, meaning I'm the only one in my own study, so I'm going to keep measuring, but the mechanisms and the results are aligned so far with human data. I chose tesamorelin specifically over CJC because of the FDA approval history, but I can understand why people might want to try CJC. And I want to say this clearly. Everything I take comes from a licensed U.S. compounding pharmacy. Certificate of analysis on every batch, made in the United States under USP sterility standards. That is the standard I hold myself to. It should be the standard for anyone considering these compounds. BPC-157, genuinely interesting, and I'm watching the July FDA advisory panel closely. I haven't injected it personally because the gray market quality makes it a little murky, but it is something that I'm considering more for my patients that need help with healing. In plastic surgery, healing is everything. If someone can heal better, that is something that I'm genuinely interested in. And if I give it to someone, I always have these conversations about the fact that it's in a gray zone, but if you're willing to take that risk, it could be worth some benefit. Bottom line, peptides are not a miracle medicine, and they're not just pure marketing. They're a diverse class of compounds at every different stage of scientific development, navigating the most significant regulatory shift this space has ever seen. Some have real compelling evidence. Some are overhyped. All of them deserve a real physician conversation, a licensed U.S. pharmacy, and a certificate of analysis, not a Reddit thread and an overseas supplier. And that's all we have for today, folks. Please leave a review, a message in the comments or DMs on social if you want to help this budding podcaster find his voice. The lines are open and I'm always listening. I'm Chris Lee, MD. This is Honestly, and I'll see you out there.